Much, Kaylin. All right, well, thank you for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here, and I wanted to say thank you also to the Idaho Museum of Mining and Geology for inviting me to share my research with everyone today and for hosting this event. I've been honored to be part of the collaborative planning for the IMMG's new exhibit on Idaho. I was fortunate enough to get a little sneak peek of it about a couple months ago, and would absolutely encourage folks to visit when they can, to see the artifacts and replicas on display, to read about the important contributions that made by Chinese miners across the state of Idaho. So what I'm going to talk about today is a smaller piece of that larger history, but it'll be focusing on the historic archaeology of southern Idaho's Boise Basin. I'm going to see if that Boise Basin stumbles me today more than once. I'm going to begin with some historical background on the Boise Basin gold rush and the global community that it drew to then territorial Idaho. I'll then delve into a few specific stories that are being uncovered by recent historical and archaeological research. And these, I hope, will provide a more personal perspective on the many ways that Chinese miners interacted with, participated in, shaped, and maintained the Boise Basin mining industry for nearly half a decade. Before getting into all of that, I do want to make two quick acknowledgements. The first thing that I want to make sure to mention up front is that although what I'm going to be talking about today is mostly taken from my own dissertation research, and therefore any errors are undoubtedly my own, it's part of a larger project and partnership between the Boise National Forest and the University of Idaho. And so it has relied on the hard work and support of many more people than just me. You will see some of these very smart folks named in my acknowledgements at the end of this presentation, along with a selection of some of the excellent references that I'll be drawing from today. And then last but not least, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that all of what I'm going to discuss today takes place on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Shoshone-Bannock peoples, who were and are the original residents of the Boise Basin. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Make sure everyone can see that.
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you. So as many of you probably already know, Idaho's Boise Basin lies in a mountainous and mineral-rich region located northeast of Boise, Idaho. The basin, as it's called, encompasses approximately 250 square miles of hills, gulches, and gold-bearing creeks, which descend from some encircling mountains. Evidence suggests that Chinese miners from California may have been the first non-native people to discover gold in the area as early as 1856. It was a highly publicized discovery by the European American Party, led by Moses Spahn and George Grimes 6 years later, however, that initiated a true rush on the Boise Basin in 1862. This so-called initial gold discovery was made along what would become to be known as Grimes Creek. Within a year, mining camps and towns sprung up along Grimes and other drainages, many with names that alluded to their primary industry. For example, Placerville, Gold Hill, Portsburg, and Granite Creek. Other early towns included Boston, the site of the Grimes Party discovery, Pioneerville, Centerville, and Bannock City, later renamed Idaho City. And all of these towns have fascinating stories associated with them, but the ones, or the areas at least, that I'm going to focus on today are these. And that would be Idaho City, the Grimes Creek drainage, and the Ophir Creek drainages. The Idaho Territory was established in March of 1863. By September of that year, the basin contained one of the largest population centers in the Pacific Northwest, with over 14,000 residents as compared to Boise's meager 725. From the start, this incoming population represented a global mix of migrants from Europe, Asia, and other parts of the US. Foreign birthplaces for residents recorded by US census takers include countries like Ireland, Germany, Portugal, Mexico, Sweden, Russia, and Greece, just to name a few. But Basinites of Chinese ancestry outnumbered all other foreign-born residents combined. In fact, by 1870, census takers recorded that 49.9% of people in the basin had been born in China. Given the difficulty of enumerating miners dispersed across claims in the forest, this percentage may have actually been even higher. While the proportion of Chinese miners in the basin was greater than in other locales, Chinese miners were by no means unusual across the West. As numerous historians have documented, Chinese prospectors were among the first and the most numerous gold rushers to flock to California in the wake of 1849. As gold discoveries spread inland, so too did Chinese placer miners, who by 1870 accounted for a full quarter of the mining population in the American West. The vast majority of these miners and of their fellow Chinese migrants came from the Pearl River Delta region in China's Guangdong province, an area roughly the size of Utah that scholars describe as having established an already complex, commercialized, and outward-looking economy by the 19th century. For hundreds of years prior to the discovery of gold in California, Chinese from this area had been traveling overseas to work in gold, silver, and tin mines in Southeast Asia. Gold mining also historically occurred within China, often seasonally, with workers returning to home villages in the off-season to farm using many of the same water management techniques to irrigate their fields that were common in placer, gold, and tin mining. Driven by multiple factors, including wars, population growth, and lack of arable land, migration as an economic strategy was supported by Guangdong families, extended clan relationships, and cultural organizations that pooled resources, cover passage fees, and provided new arrivals with jobs, housing, and other support. As a result, at least some of the Chinese migrants who entered the Boise Basin in the 19th century were likely to have arrived with prior experience in mining or water management techniques. Those who lacked such experiences would have benefited from what were, by then, well-established networks of social, economic, and familial ties that connected even the most remote locations to products and news from home, to generational knowledge on mining and migration, and to localized strategies developed by the migrants who preceded them. This combination of specialized knowledge and resource access can be seen in the ability of Chinese miners to take on all sorts of different roles within mining communities, even during periods of violence and exclusion. Although Californians at first recruited and welcomed Chinese miners, by the 1860s and 1870s, increasingly hostile laws, taxes, and rhetoric began to express a growing anti-Chinese sentiment in the West. At its worst, this racist sentiment erupted into physical violence against miners and communities who were attacked, robbed, chased out of town, or had their homes burned or were killed. Other less violent but widely felt effects of this movement were a series of legal actions that began in California and spread to neighboring states. These included laws prohibiting Chinese from staking mining claims, from mining within certain districts, from buying or selling property, and that imposed taxes on Chinese miners. Many of these state laws were eventually overturned or struck down, but they were followed by more sweeping federal legislation aimed at curtailing Chinese immigration altogether, most notably the 1870 Page Law, which restricted Chinese women from entering the United States, and the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act that prohibited all further immigration of laborers and declared Chinese immigrants ineligible for naturalization and citizenship. As in other Western states, Boise Basin residents initially passed laws prohibiting Chinese from mining in newly established districts. As a result, many of the first Chinese in the basin worked in other fields, providing essential goods and services to the burgeoning community. Chinese entrepreneurs were especially prevalent in the laundry and fresh produce industries, and by the 1880s had cornered both of these markets. Launderers worked out of houses in many basin towns, while farmers tended small plots, picking fresh vegetables and peddling them door to door in Idaho City and other communities. The variety of professions taken up by Chinese entrepreneurs is evident in census data, which records 28 different occupations held by Chinese residents, including merchants, clerks, barbers, butchers, doctors, porters, cooks, carpenters, cobblers, restaurant owners, blacksmiths, and interpreters. Despite arriving in smaller numbers and facing disproportionately restrictive legal and social barriers, Chinese women and children were also a part of basin communities. And one of the reasons that I absolutely love the larger photo on this slide here is that if you look very closely, you can actually see one of those Chinese children sitting on the lap of the figure circled there. By 1870, at least 54 Chinese women and 10 Chinese children were living in the basin. Census data describe most single Chinese women as prostitutes or, intriguingly, as placer miners, though both of these designations are somewhat suspect. As wives and domestic laborers, Chinese women were also part of households that earned a living peddling goods or by operating stores, restaurants, groceries, or laundries. At least one Chinese woman was unquestionably involved in the mining industry. Deeds on file at the Boise County Recorder's Office in Idaho City show that Dai Tai Dai Sang, the daughter of Idaho City's Chinese merchant Lo Ki, purchased mining claims and on several occasions even took over mining leases from other Chinese companies. Exclusionary mining laws remained in effect until 1867. Repeals of those laws were at least in part motivated by a desire to reinvigorate the economy, which at that point had begun to slump as mining returns dwindled. Gold in the basin primarily occurs in alluvial, meaning river deposits that over geologic time have washed from their source further upstream. The methods used to recover this kind of gold are collectively known as placer mining, a type of mining that relies on water to wash gold particles free from surrounding sediment. When alluvial gold was near the surface and water was abundant, relatively simple placer mining techniques, panning, for example, or using rocker screens like the ones pictured here, were enough for a single placer miner to turn a tidy profit. As near surface gold deposits were depleted, or as water became scarce, however, more labor-intensive placer mining techniques and more complicated water management systems were required. In the basin, as European Americans unable or unwilling to make this transition moved on, the population and the economy dwindled. Allowing Chinese into districts infused them with additional laborers, as well as a steady supply of buyers for abandoned claims. It also had a more direct fiscal impact. An 1864 state law required Chinese miners to pay a monthly tax. Although not all Boise Basin Chinese willingly paid this discriminatory tax, its potential impact can be seen in its precedent, the California's foreign miners tax, which brought in an estimated $5 million, totaling 25 to 50% of all California state revenue before 1870. Idaho's foreign miner tax helped struggling economies, but along with other federal legislation, continued to privilege non-Chinese miners. Nonetheless, by 1870, 92% of the nearly 2,000 Chinese living in the basin were employed in gold mining in one way or another. Chinese miners frequently excelled at more intensive placer mining techniques, such as operating sluice boxes, hydraulic mining, and managing complicated ditch, flume, and reservoir systems to deliver water to mining grounds. Some Chinese innovations, like the undershot water wheel and the Chinese pump, modified from traditional irrigation technology, were widely adapted and adopted within the American mining industry. State Mine Inspector Robert Bell observed that Idaho's Chinese miners were very thorough in their work, generally well organized in their companies with administrative heads, and that their operations included some ingenious bucket, belt, and elevator pumping devices for low-lying, wet ground and deep stripping operations, which were handled by wheelbarrow. Drawing on these skills, communal and generational knowledge, and even specific types of tool use and modification all helped Boise Basin miners fill many roles within the economy. Archaeological sites in the Boise Basin highlight this diversity and give us an idea of what day-to-day life might have looked like for Chinese miners who were involved in a variety of different mining enterprises. So to take a closer look at some of these individuals and their approach to mining in the basin, I'm going to start with what at first might seem like a counterintuitive place with a couple of well-known Chinese merchants, Pan Yam and Wang Chung. Some of you may be familiar with this building, which still stands on the corner of Montgomery and Commercial Streets in Idaho City and is best known as the Pan Yam store. The building, owned by the Idaho City Historical Foundation, has been restored and, as you can see, now serves as a small museum that's open to the public. The structure that would house the Pan Yam store was built in 1865. It passed through several owners and short-lived businesses, including the Pujad restaurant, before Wang Chung and his associates purchased it in 1873 for $1,500. Wang Chung, along with his partners Pan Yam and Pan Yep, ran a general merchandise shop out of the building in the years that followed. In 1875, Pan Yam bought out Wang Chung's interest in the store and continued to operate it in his name until 1904 when he returned to China. Wang Chung retained ownership of the property throughout this period, eventually selling the building 2 years after Pan Yam's departure for the recorded sum of $1. When the Pan Yam store was restored in the late 1990s, Idaho City Historical Foundation, Boise National Forest, and Passport in Time volunteers conducted excavations in and around the structure. Because they were protected under the porch and interior floorboards, archaeological materials recovered from the Pan Yam store are remarkably well preserved and include fragile items rarely, if ever, seen in other Chinese diaspora or Chinese American sites. Paper firecrackers, incense sticks, wooden matches, and an abundance of seeds from Asian and local sources evidence the variety of foods and goods once stocked within the building, as well as the personal lives of its owners and customers who lit firecrackers to celebrate Chinese New Year, burned incense to honor gods and ancestors, and ate specialty foods shipped from China alongside produce harvested from local gardens. Other artifacts are clearly associated with mining. These items include fragments of rubber boots, a thick flannel-like fabric, and another rare but also toxic archaeological find, liquid mercury. Also called quicksilver by miners, liquid mercury amalgamates with gold and so is used to recover small particles left behind in pans, rockers, or sluice boxes. A historical account of placer mining techniques describes the preferred method of quicksilver application as quote unquote sprinkling through a piece of cloth stretched over the opening of a repurposed bottle, like the one pictured here in the Boise Basin Museum. The mercury and other mining artifacts in Panyam's store may have been intended for customers, but could have also belonged to Panyam or Wang Chung, since both men were involved in mining, though they filled very different niches within the Boise Basin mining industry and adhered to very different strategies for success. In November of 1871, Wang Chung, along with two other partners, purchased multiple bar, gulch, and hill claims on the lower portion of Grimes Creek for $6,000, a sum that today would be equal to between $130,000 and $135,000. These claims came with dumping grounds, two small ditches, flumes, dams, reservoirs, sluice boxes, hoses, and mining implements. Whereas Wang Chung appears to have been buying into what, at least in mining terms, might be considered a long-term investment, Panyam seems to have preferred short-term contracts. Approximately 15 miles north of Wang Chung, Panyam leased what are known as the Noble Claims near Grimes Pass, shown here in 1884. Although only a one-season endeavor, leasing these claims still necessitated a significant investment of time, labor, and organization. Panyam was required to furnish and pay the entire workforce needed to mine these expensive claims, including both day and night foremen to oversee operations. Mining infrastructure and tools were leased with the property, but with the stipulation that they be kept in good working condition or replaced at the end of the lease. In exchange for his efforts, Panyam would net 75% of all cleanups, or gold recovered for that year. One might assume, as I initially did, that the person Panyam was entering this contract with would be William B. Noble, the namesake of these claims and the man circled in orange on this slide. But the signature on the Panyam lease document is actually that of his ex-wife, Hattie F. Noble, who divorced her husband, sued for and won custody of their 4 children, following an accident in which William suffered a major and debilitating head injury. After also suing to gain legal title to William's properties and mining investments, Hattie turned to the Dongsing Company of Centerville and 2 years later to Panyam to keep her former husband's claims productive. Hattie was not the only woman in the basin to find herself suddenly in possession of a former husband's mining claims and to then lease them to Chinese miners, a fact that suggests these type of relationships warrant additional research. Further south on Grimes Creek, the recently widowed Mary Hogg signed a 99-year lease for a ditch and several mining claims with the Li Su Tong Company in 1895. Elsewhere on Grimes Creek, in between the claims formerly owned by Wang Chung and those leased by Panyam, a group of interrelated archaeological sites leased by the Wang Xing Company provides yet another example of Chinese mining operations within the Boise Basin. And the lands that would eventually comprise the Wang Xing Company's holdings were at first claimed by a number of different individuals who extracted gold from bar or gulch claims along the creek. Beginning in the late 1860s, Moses Biddy, Patrick Doyle, and Stephen Dempsey began consolidating ownership of the land surrounding the no longer existent town of Boston. Together, the 3 men formed the Grimes Creek Ditch Company to bring water to their collective property. One of their ditches, known first as the Doyle Ditch and later as the Grimes Creek Ditch, was their most extensive. It ran the 8 to 10 miles between Pioneerville and Boston, furnishing water to hill claims on the east side of Grimes Creek and reportedly costs between $3,000 and $4,000 annually simply for tending and repairs. By 1880, however, Biddy had dissolved the Grimes Creek Ditch Company and begun selling the majority of his claims to his former partner, Stephen Dempsey. Dempsey, then in control of a large swath of mining claims, ditches, and water rights along the east bank of Grimes Creek, employed Chinese miners on the portion of the claims that he himself worked and leased the remaining water rights and property to other Chinese mining companies. Between 1891 and 1903, Stephen Dempsey turned the majority of his claims over to a single entity, the Wang Xing Company of Centerville. As specified in the lease document, the properties leased by the Wang Xing Company included hill claims that extended for half a mile along the east bank of Grimes Creek, water rights from the Grimes Creek Ditch, dumping ground along the creek, 2 chiefs or hydraulic monitors, 3,000 feet of iron pipe, an unspecified amount of hoses, picks, and shovels, and 2 blacksmith shops, a house, and a stable in the town of Boston. Though clearly a large-scale mining company that operated for over a decade in this location, very little historical documentation exists for the Wongsing Company. The company's name could only be located on 2 documents in the Boise County Recorder's Office. One records the signature that you see on this slide here, and another names Wongsing and Housing as co-managers of the company. In the 1980s, the Boise National Forest documented a number of archaeological sites related to the Wongsing Company's operations, though they didn't know it at the time. These sites and the archaeological collections that they have yielded help fill in the gaps in the historical record and give us a better sense of what mining for the Wongsing Company might have actually looked like. This site, for example, is located on a terrace above Grimes Creek and would have been one of the hill claims supplied with water from the construction of the Grimes Creek Company ditch. Laterals from the Grimes Creek ditch bound the site, and the still visible placer cuts intersecting these ditches appear to have been used as trash disposal locations after each was abandoned. The remains of a structure's foundation and a stacked rock feature, similar to other U-shaped hearths found at Chinese sites in the West, indicate that Chinese miners lived and worked at this site. To make the most of available water, beginning in the spring thaw, placer mining operations often ran both day and night in the basin, keeping crews of miners who were dispersed throughout the forest, working claims on a 24-hour cycle, fed, healthy, and supplied with the necessary tools and equipment was no doubt a logistical feat for firms like the Wongsing Company. Some of the strategies used to meet this challenge can be seen in the artifacts recovered from Wongsing Company sites, which evidence on-site processing and secondary butchering of meat. Chinese-style cleavers and fragments of very large diameter woks, like the ones shown on this slide here, were found at multiple sites in the Wongsing Company's holdings, along with animal bones that signify use of the entire animal from head to hoof. These artifacts reveal a strategy for feeding hungry crews of miners in an efficient manner. In comparison to European American mining sites, where canned goods are often the most frequently recovered food remains, this diet would not only have been more cost-effective, but also more nutritious, and would have preserved some Chinese dietary preferences and foodways. Cuts of meat from pig's feet and heads, for example, are common ingredients in a number of Cantonese dishes. While specific cuts of beef, chicken, and pork, along with half or whole hogs, are recorded as being purchased locally at establishments like the McDevitt Meat Market in Idaho City, other products found at Wongsing mining sites traveled through much larger global networks before reaching their final destination. Sherds of the distinctive Chinese brown glazed stoneware seen on this slide are ubiquitous across Chinese mining sites in the West and would have come from containers in a variety of shapes and sizes used to import foods and liquids into the United States. Larger containers, some up to several feet tall, held bulk items like rice, sheet sugar, cooking oil, or liquor. Smaller spouted containers, like the one pictured here, contain seasonings such as vinegar, peanut oil, or soy sauce. Other shapes, some with beautiful glazes like the one seen here, held pickled, salted, or preserved vegetables. Sourced through thriving trade networks that extended back to southern China, these items were likely sold to the Wongsing Company by Chinese merchants operating out of stores in Centerville, Placerville, and Idaho City. To judge from their frequency at archaeological sites, these items arrived in the basin in great quantity and formed a substantial, though by no means exclusive, part of miners' diets. Chinese imports were not the only international products to be used by Chinese miners. Bottles recovered from Wongsing holdings can be sourced to companies in Hamburg, Germany, and to Glasgow and Fifeshire, Scotland, as well as to more regional production centers like San Francisco. Contrary to stereotypes about Chinese businesses being insular, Chinese merchants in the Boise Basin sold many European and American products in their stores, and over time developed relationships with regular suppliers of these goods. Records kept by the Lokaki family of Idaho City list items purchased for Boise Basin companies through their store. The size and price of these orders indicate the scale at which both merchants and mining companies were operating. One order, for example, is for $100 worth of rice, and that sum would have purchased approximately $2,000 or 2,000 pounds of rice in the year that that letter was written. Another order addressed to the A. Finkenhausen Company of San Francisco requests 4 barrels of whiskey, 500 pounds of coffee, 250 pounds of beans, 275 bottles of port wine, 200 pounds of Japanese tea, 50 cases of nut oil, 5 cases of oysters, and 500 pounds of tobacco. Keeping miners fed would not have been the only hurdle to running large-scale and long-term mining operations like those of the Wongsing Company. Maintaining miles of ditches, iron pipe, and sluice boxes, not to mention the numerous shovels, wheelbarrows, and picks used on a daily and nightly basis, would have all been tasks that required constant vigilance. In fact, one of the enduring legacies of mining in the Boise Basin is that anywhere you walk throughout the forest, there is likely a broken shovel or 3 somewhere nearby. Some of the way that Chinese miners dealt with this are visible at Wongsing mining sites. Creative reuse of metal artifacts like broken pickaxe tips reused as wedges and broken pitchfork tines reused as probes were likely simple on-site solutions to an endless need for tools. Larger metal artifacts like the square can that's pictured here, repurposed through the addition of holes punched with a square nail, could have served as a makeshift sieve or a screen for the hopper box of a rocker. Still more construction and repairs were likely to have taken place at 2 blacksmith shops leased by the Wongsing Company in the town of Boston. Because it was placer mined and then dredged out of existence in the last decades of the 19th century, few traces of Boston exist to reveal what Wongsing operations might have looked like there. Fortunately, though, other sites in the basin contain some clues. So leaving for now the Grimes Creek drainage, my final example of a Boise Basin mining site comes from a small parcel along Ophir Creek that was leased by the Woe Hop Company of Placerville. The property leased by the Woe Hop Company began, much like that of the Wongsing Company, as disparate mining claims and ditches owned by different individuals. In comparison to Grimes Creek, however, Ophir Creek had lower annual water flows, which made for shorter placer seasons, lower gold yields, and increased importance of ditches, reservoirs, and flumes. These factors may help explain why, when Placerville resident Henry Reed began purchasing long stretches of mining ground along Ophir Creek, he rarely owned water rights or claims outright. Between 1875 and 1903, Henry Reed's name appears on multiple mining deeds, along with a rotating cast of other investors who own anything from a 1/2 to a 1/20th interest in the properties mentioned. In 1882, Henry Reed purchased his largest property, the Reed Placer Mine that still bears his name on modern maps, along with several ditches conveying water to the claim. The longest of these, called the Updike, then the Mountain, and finally the Upper Ditch, stretched for 3.5 miles along Ophir Creek, tapping several reservoirs along its route. In 1889, one of the men who held the majority interest in Henry Reed's claims leased a portion of them and water rights from the Upper Ditch to the Chinese Woe Hop Company. Though the term for the lease was 99 years, Henry Reed's death in 1903, followed by the sale of his former property in 1906, would cut short this tenure. Unlike the Wongsing document, the Woe Hop lease, which is shown here, does not specifically transfer any tools that might indicate the mining techniques the company used. But previous deeds make it clear that the primary activity on Reed's properties was hydraulic mining at the site of the Reed Placer. Further upstream, at sites like this one, ditches and reservoirs were surrounded by much smaller claims that were likely worked with a combination of hydraulic and hand methods. Bulldozing by 20th century miners has destroyed much of the surface of this particular site, leaving the reservoirs seen here as the only superficial clues to the historical activities of the Woe Hop Company. Excavations in the 1980s, however, indicate that in addition to water management, small-scale mining and blacksmithing also took place here. Mining-related artifacts from this site include fragments of a traditional gold pan, along with a complete example of a smaller pan, known alternately as a blow pan, blow box, or a gold blowing tray. These trays were made of a heavy tin and had 3 rimmed sides that tapered to an opening on one end. Blowing gently across this opening while tapping the side of the tray would lift fine sand from any gold particles and blow it away. Both gold pans and gold blowing trays like these were used frequently alongside other placer mining methods. A large number of other mining tools were also recovered from this site, though their conditions suggest that their presence was much more likely for repair or recycling than for mining. These include 25 shovels and shovel pieces. Many are like those pictured here. They are shovel blades with portions such as the tips missing, or they are blade fragments that show signs of having been removed with shears. There is also the unusual item pictured in the top middle of this slide, which I believe is a hand-forged pickaxe in progress, something I will explain a little bit more in a minute. It is accompanied by 15 pickaxe tips that show signs of having been cut with a hot chisel. These items, combined with fragments of piled metal, slag, and scrap metal, all indicate that this site was probably occupied by a blacksmith tasked with repairing, modifying, and creating tools for Woe Hop miners. Rather than waste a broken shovel, blacksmiths for the Woe Hop company may have been able to put these items to new uses. The shovel blade fragments in this collection show signs of having been cut into specific shapes. The resulting flat metal squares or linear strips may have been used to patch or repair other items, and excess metal could have been kept as raw material. Woe Hop blacksmiths also appear to have been repairing and making pickaxes, another tool that broke or became dull with some regularity at mining sites. In the 19th century, most pickaxes were made of wrought iron with only the ends made of steel. To replace a steel bit that had become dull or chipped, blacksmiths cut the steel from the iron and then split the end of the pickaxe with a hot chisel. A new steel bit could then be inserted into the split and joined to the iron shaft using a tongue weld. Repairing a pickaxe this way saved the majority of the metal as well as the tool itself for further use and profit, while also making life easier for the miners themselves, who no longer had to expend the extra energy to repeatedly swing a dull pickaxe. Woe Hop blacksmiths may have been making life easier for company miners in other ways too. In addition to modified metal items, this collection contains examples of bottles cut into shapes like glasses, the lips of which have been ground down to produce a smooth drinking surface. 665 footwear fragments, most of which are rubber boots embedded with hobnails, and 213 additional hobnails are also included in this collection. Hobnails, which are like specific shoe nails, such as these, inserted into the soles of rubber boots, would have helped Woe Hop miners to maintain traction in the inevitably wet, muddy, and slippery conditions produced by placer mining. It was not just the Woe Hop miners who modified their boots this way, however. Boots with hobnails like these were also recovered from long-seen sites at sites across the basin and even across the Pacific Northwest. Other artifacts are frequently found that have been modified in consistent ways too. Cans flattened for use as roofing shingles, metal strips pierced with holes to create graters, and punctured cans possibly used as strainers, noodle makers, or containers for growing sprouts. These artifacts are the products of individual agency and creativity, yet in their wide dispersal, they also reflect a kind of informal, shared knowledge about what items could be efficiently or expediently converted into others. Together with the specialized skills represented in blacksmithing materials at the site, these artifacts show us some of the ways that Chinese miners put individual ingenuity, communal knowledge, and technical skill to use in the daily operations of mining companies. Well-worn rubber boots like these are also a reminder that on claims large and small, placer mining was hard physical work that even in the best of circumstances didn't always pay off. Across the basin, Chinese miners like Wang Cheng, Han Yam, the Wang Xing, and the Woe Hop companies faced these challenges in a variety of ways. Their individual archaeological signatures evidence that Chinese miners used pans, rockers, and hydraulic giants, purchased and leased lands on both short and long-term contracts, operated large, extensive holdings, tended ditches and reservoirs, maintained, modified, and even created tools, and did business with women, European American landowners, and merchants both local and distant. In short, Chinese miners did it all. Instead of simply filling one specific niche, the need for cheap labor, as is so oftenly assumed, Chinese miners in the basin took advantage of and often excelled at a variety of different roles within mining networks. This required embracing diverse strategies like the one seen here, sometimes using the tools at hand, purchasing items in bulk, reusing or repurposing materials, or drawing on the technical skill of specialists among their midst. All of these things increased Chinese miners' chances of success while also maintaining what could be a very fickle industry. Ultimately, the legacy of Chinese miners in the basin is not only that they found ways to support themselves despite the odds, but that they also supported the Boise Basin mining industry and community as a whole for nearly half a century. So with that, I'm going to say thank you for listening to my summary talk today. And again, thanks to the people and institutions that are helping to make this ongoing research possible. The archaeological sites that I have talked about today are on both private and public lands and were preserved and documented by a number of people. This is a really important history that we are all stewards of in a way. So if you do happen to be hiking through the Boise National Forest, for example, and see one of those ubiquitous broken metal shovels, take a moment to marvel at the history that you get to be so close to, and then leave it where it is so that it can contribute to more research like this, and so that we can all enjoy it. For anyone who is as nerdy as I am and is interested in historical placer mining techniques, the first reference on this list is a pretty fun read. And then the rest going down from there are all really great publications on Boise Basin history that I would absolutely recommend for anyone who's interested in reading more about this specific topic. And so with that, I think I'm gonna stop my screen share and maybe we have time, hopefully we have time for questions.
Wonderful talk. Thank you, Renae. That's really a fabulous topic, and it seems like there are so many questions that sort of open up from this lecture of yours. I am absolutely fascinated by the topic, obviously, and I think a lot of my fellow Idahoans are too. So we have some time for questions. We actually have about 15 minutes. So if you have a question, please feel free to type it into the chat box, and I will go ahead and ask that question on your behalf.
I also want to say that if anybody has a question that they maybe don't want to share here or comes to them later,